It was mid-afternoon on February 20th, 2023, and workers at Schumann Co were going about their regular Monday routines in the metal foundry outside Cleveland, Ohio. The facility hummed with the familiar sounds of industrial production, molten copper and bronze alloys flowing through channels, workers monitoring furnaces that had operated safely for decades in this corner of Oakwood Village. Steven Mullins, a 46-year-old maintenance worker who had devoted nearly 30 years of his life to this company, was performing his duties somewhere in the building, likely unaware that this ordinary Monday would be his last day on Earth. The temperature inside the foundry was always intense, with furnaces maintaining metals at temperatures exceeding 1000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt copper and bronze into the liquid state required for casting into ingots and pellets. This was dangerous work, everyone knew that, but it was work that had been done the same way for decades, following patterns established long before most current employees had been hired. At approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, something went catastrophically wrong in a sequence of events that would unfold with such devastating speed that most people in the building would have no time to understand what was happening before their world exploded into flames and chaos. What followed was one of Ohio's most dramatic industrial disasters in recent memory, an explosion so powerful that Doppler weather radar detected the massive smoke plume rising into the atmosphere, an event that would kill one man who had dedicated his entire adult working life to the company, injure 14 others with severe burns and trauma, and raise urgent questions about why repeated safety warnings had been ignored, why previous accidents involving molten metal had not prompted comprehensive safety overhauls, and why a facility with a documented history of violations continued operating without the fundamental changes that might have prevented this catastrophe. Schumann Co had been a fixture in the Cleveland area metalworking industry for over a century, established in the 1920s when American manufacturing was booming and demand for copper and bronze alloys seemed limitless. The company carved out a profitable niche in the specialty metals market, recycling scrap copper and bronze, melting it down in their foundry, refining it into high-quality alloys, and casting it into standardized ingot and pellet forms that other manufacturers would purchase for their own production needs. It was unglamorous but essential work, the kind of behind-the-scenes industrial operation that keeps modern manufacturing economies functioning. The foundry itself was located at 22,500 Alexander Road, positioned in an industrial area straddling the border between Oakwood Village and Bedford Heights, surrounded by other manufacturing facilities and commercial operations. The building was not particularly remarkable from the outside, a functional industrial structure designed for utility rather than aesthetics, the kind of place that thousands of workers across America enter every day to perform the hot, difficult, dangerous work of transforming raw materials into useful products. Inside, the foundry contained the massive furnaces necessary to melt metals, the casting equipment to pour molten alloys into molds, the handling systems to move incredibly hot materials safely, and all the associated machinery and infrastructure required for metal production. It was inherently dangerous work. Molten metal at over 1000 degrees Celsius is essentially liquid fire, capable of causing catastrophic burns on contact, capable of explosive reactions if it encounters water or other incompatible substances, capable of releasing toxic fumes, capable of structural damage if containment fails. Everyone who worked there understood these risks. The company's own safety materials acknowledged that working in a foundry meant dealing with molten hot metal and accepting inherent dangers. But understanding risk and properly managing it are entirely different things. The company's safety record told a troubling story that should have served as increasingly urgent warnings that serious problems existed in how the facility operated. Records from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration painted a picture of an operation that repeatedly failed to maintain adequate safety standards and that treated worker injuries as isolated incidents rather than symptoms of systemic failures. In 2019, just 4 years before the fatal explosion, an employee suffered third-degree burns when molten metal splashed onto his coveralls and set his clothing on fire. This was not a minor incident. Third-degree burns destroy all layers of skin and can cause permanent disfigurement and disability. The fact that molten metal could splash onto a worker's clothing and ignite it indicated serious failures in containment procedures, protective equipment, work processes, or some combination of all three. Rather than treating this as a wake-up call demanding comprehensive safety reviews, the incident was handled as an individual accident, the injured worker was treated, and operations continued largely unchanged. OSHA documented the incident, and presumably issued citations, but no fundamental transformation in safety culture or procedures appears to have occurred. In 2022, just 1 year before the explosion, OSHA records show the company paid penalties for failing to control hazardous energy, a critical safety violation in any industrial setting but especially in facilities dealing with high-temperature processes and heavy machinery. Hazardous energy control, often called lockout-tagout procedures, is fundamental to preventing accidents during maintenance and servicing of equipment. Failures in this area can lead to workers being injured by unexpected equipment activation, energy releases, or other preventable incidents. Again, the company paid the fine and apparently made whatever minimal corrections were required, but the pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. This was a facility that responded to safety violations reactively, paying fines and making surface-level corrections, rather than proactively examining its entire safety culture and operations to identify and eliminate root causes of dangerous conditions. The explosion and resulting fire was so intense that Doppler weather radar, the same technology meteorologists use to track precipitation and storm systems, detected the massive smoke plume rising into the atmosphere. This is an extraordinarily rare occurrence, indicating just how much material was being lofted into the air by the intensity of the fire. Weather radar works by sending out radio waves and measuring what bounces back, typically used to detect water droplets and ice particles in clouds. For smoke to show up on Doppler radar requires an enormous concentration of particulates rising to significant altitude, creating a detectable signature that the radar can differentiate from background atmospheric conditions. Meteorologists watching their displays that afternoon saw the unmistakable signature of something catastrophic, a plume of smoke so massive it looked like a volcanic eruption or major industrial catastrophe, which of course it was. The image was shared on social media by weather professionals, adding to the growing awareness that something terrible was happening in Oakwood Village. The smoke was visible for miles, a towering column of black and grey that served as a beacon drawing attention to the disaster unfolding at Mary. Schumann, drivers on nearby highways could see it clearly across the landscape. People in downtown Cleveland, roughly 15 miles away, reported seeing the massive smoke cloud rising above the city skyline in the distance. The visual impact was deeply profound and clear. Emergency response began within minutes of the explosion, with multiple fire departments from surrounding communities converging on Alexander Road. The initial 911 calls reported an explosion, fire, injuries, debris everywhere, and the unmistakable urgency of a mass casualty incident. Fire Captain Brian DeRocco of the Oakwood Village Fire Department was among the first responders to arrive and was immediately confronted with the scale of the disaster. Debris was scattered across a radius of hundreds of feet, multiple people were injured and needed immediate medical attention. The fire was massive and spreading. The interior of the building was, in his words that he would later use at press conferences, catastrophic. The situation required a coordinated response far beyond what any single fire department could provide, so mutual aid protocols kicked in, bringing firefighters and equipment from more than a dozen different departments in the surrounding area. Approximately 60 firefighters would ultimately respond to the scene, working in dangerous conditions to fight the fire, search for victims and prevent the disaster from spreading to adjacent buildings. The work was extraordinarily hazardous. The building was structurally compromised by the explosion and fire. The interior contained unknown hazards including potential pockets of molten metal, damaged equipment that might fail catastrophically, toxic smoke and fumes from burning materials, and the ever-present risk of secondary explosions or collapses. Firefighters had to balance the urgency of searching for potential survivors against the very real risk of becoming casualties themselves if they pushed too aggressively into unsafe areas. The injuries were severe and numerous. Captain DeRocco reported seeing quite a few burn victims on the scene, people whose skin and clothing had been exposed to extreme heat and flames, suffering the kind of painful, dangerous injuries that require immediate specialized medical treatment. 13 people were transported to local hospitals by ambulance and helicopter. At least one person had to be pulled from the rubble before being taken to the hospital, suggesting they had been trapped by collapsing structures or debris. The most critically injured were distributed to trauma centers equipped to handle severe burns and blast injuries. Metro Health Medical Center received 4 patients, 2 of whom were in critical condition with life-threatening injuries. University hospitals received 7 patients, though their conditions were apparently less severe as all 7 were discharged by the following day. 1 patient required helicopter medical evacuation, flown from the scene to a trauma center with the specialized burn unit, and critical care capabilities needed for the most severe injuries. The helicopter evacuation was notable because it indicated injuries so severe that ground ambulance transport was considered too slow, that every minute counted in getting this person to definitive medical care. For burn victims, the first hours are critical. The body's response to severe burns includes fluid shifts, potential infection, pain management challenges, and the risk of multi-organ system failure. Getting severely burned patients to specialized burn centers quickly can mean the difference between survival and death, between recovery and permanent disability. The foundry had passed annual fire safety inspections, and officials noted the building had been in good standing. But fire safety and occupational safety are different things. Schumann satisfied fire marshals while accumulating OSHA violations, illustrating how facilities can fall through cracks of fragmented oversight systems. The workers, including Steven Mullins, who had spent nearly 3 decades at the company, had learned to live with the risks, had internalized the company's message that foundry work was inherently dangerous and that accidents sometimes happened despite everyone's best efforts. This is a common dynamic in industrial settings, where workers, needing their jobs and trusting management, may not push back against conditions that outside observers might find unacceptable. The normalization of deviance is well documented in safety failures, where practices that deviate from proper standards gradually become accepted through repeated exposure without immediate catastrophic consequences. Each time molten metal splashes without serious injury, each near miss occurs without becoming actual accident, each inspection passes despite underlying problems, it reinforces the dangerous belief that current practices are acceptable. The afternoon of February 20th began like countless others at the foundry, with workers arriving for their shifts, furnaces heating metals to casting temperature, production schedules being followed, maintenance tasks being performed, and the complex choreography of industrial metal production unfolding according to long-established patterns. Steven Mullins was somewhere in the facility, likely performing one of the many maintenance tasks required to keep a foundry operating. At approximately 2:15 p.m., witnesses in nearby buildings and on surrounding streets heard and felt something that would be seared into their memories forever. A massive explosion rocked the area with enough force to shake buildings, break windows, and trigger immediate panic among anyone close enough to experience it. Stephanie Davis was working in her office building less than 1,000 feet from the Schumann facility when she suddenly felt the entire structure start to shake beneath her. Her first thought was confusion rather than fear, her mind struggling to find an explanation for why a building would shake in Ohio, a state not known for seismic activity. She walked to a window to investigate and saw something that defied easy comprehension, a huge cloud of black smoke rising into the sky from a building she could see across the parking lots and access roads. A smoke plume so massive and dark that it looked like something from a disaster movie, rather than a Monday afternoon in suburban Cleveland. Davis and her co-workers rushed outside to see what had happened, and were confronted with a scene of destruction that seemed impossible. Debris was scattered across roofs and parking lots. Windows in neighboring buildings had been blown out by the force of the blast. Cars in nearby parking areas were damaged, some crushed by falling debris, others dented and covered in material that had been thrown through the air by the explosion. Pieces of building materials, chunks of metal, fragments of equipment, all lay scattered in a radius extending hundreds of feet from the foundry. Some of the debris was still burning, small fires scattered across the landscape like a battlefield. Inside the Schumann facility, conditions were far worse than the external destruction suggested. The explosion had originated somewhere in the foundry area where molten metal was being processed, likely involving a catastrophic failure of containment, combined with some kind of triggering event that caused the explosive expansion. When molten metal comes into contact with water, even small amounts of moisture, the water instantly vaporizes into steam with a volume expansion of roughly 1,600 times. This explosive vaporization can propel molten metal outward like shrapnel, can rupture containment vessels, can trigger cascading failures as one breach leads to others. Whatever specific mechanism initiated the Schumann explosion, the result was devastating. Molten copper and bronze alloys at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius were released from their normal containment, spreading fire throughout the foundry, igniting anything combustible, causing severe burns to anyone in the vicinity, and creating the massive fireball and smoke plume that witnesses saw from outside. Workers in the foundry area faced an impossible situation. Some were burned immediately by the initial blast and the molten metal it dispersed, others were trapped by rapidly spreading fire and toxic smoke. The interior of the building, which would later be described by fire officials as looking catastrophic, became a maze of flames, collapsed structures, and hazardous conditions. Those who could flee did so, escaping through whatever exits remained accessible, many suffering from burns and smoke inhalation. Those who couldn't escape quickly enough faced increasingly desperate circumstances as fire consumed the building around them. One person did not make it to the hospital alive. Steven Mullins, 46 years old, from North Ridgeville, Ohio, died in the explosion. The Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office would later confirm his death, though the specific cause, whether from burns, blast trauma, smoke inhalation, or some combination, was not publicly detailed. What was publicly known was that Mullins had worked for Schumann for nearly 30 years, almost his entire adult working life. He had been barely out of his teens when he started at the company, had spent 3 decades showing up to work, performing his maintenance duties, collecting his paychecks, supporting whatever family and life he had built outside the foundry walls. He was, according to the company's statement, a good friend to all, and would be greatly missed. These formulaic words of mourning, sincere though they may have been, could not capture the full tragedy of a life cut short by an industrial accident that was almost certainly preventable if proper safety measures had been prioritized over the years. Mullins spent working there. He had survived the 2019 molten metal splash incident. He had worked through all the OSHA violations and warnings. He had shown up every day to a facility that prioritized production over safety, that responded to worker injuries reactively rather than proactively, that treated safety compliance as a box-checking exercise rather than a fundamental operational requirement. And on a Monday afternoon in February, doing the work he had done for 3 decades, Steven Mullins died because the accumulated negligence and corner cutting finally produced the catastrophic outcome that should have been anticipated and prevented. By 5 p.m., roughly 3 hours after the explosion, firefighters had the bulk of the fire under control, though hotspots continued to burn and required ongoing suppression efforts. The immediate danger of the fire spreading to engulf surrounding buildings had been contained, but the Schumann facility itself was destroyed. The interior was described as catastrophic, a designation that in fire service terminology indicates destruction so complete that the structure is likely a total loss. The damage was extensive not just from the initial explosion, but from the hours of fire that followed, with high temperatures weakening steel, destroying equipment, collapsing sections of roof and walls, and creating a scene of devastation that would take days to fully assess. The foundry, which had operated continuously for decades, producing copper and bronze alloys day after day, year after year, was now a burned-out shell, its production capabilities destroyed, its employees displaced, its future uncertain. The company issued a statement expressing condolences for Mullins' death, thanking emergency responders for their efforts, and promising cooperation with OSHA and other investigating authorities. The statement mentioned working with employees regarding their needs while the facility remained idle, suggesting at least some hope of eventual restart of operations, though whether and when the facility might reopen was entirely unclear in the aftermath of such catastrophic destruction. The investigation into what caused the explosion began immediately, though determining exact causation in industrial accidents is often complex and time-consuming. The Ohio State Fire Marshal's office announced that the blast did not appear to be the result of criminal activity, ruling out intentional acts like arson or sabotage. This left accidental causes, which in a foundry environment could include numerous possibilities. Molten metal contact with water is one of the most common causes of explosive failures in foundries. Water can come from many sources: coolant leaks, moisture in scrap metal being melted, water-based hydraulic systems, even humidity condensing on cold surfaces. When molten metal encounters water, the instantaneous vaporization produces explosive force sufficient to breach containment and propel molten material outward. Equipment failure is another possibility, with furnaces, crucibles, ladles, and other containment vessels all subject to failure from corrosion, thermal stress, manufacturing defects, or inadequate maintenance. A containment breach could allow molten metal to flow into areas where it encounters materials or conditions that trigger explosive reactions. Process errors are also possible, with incorrect operating procedures, failed safety interlocks, or human mistakes leading to dangerous conditions. In facilities with documented safety violations and previous incidents, multiple contributing factors often exist. The proximate cause might be a specific equipment failure or process error, but the root causes typically involve systemic issues like inadequate maintenance, insufficient safety procedures, poor training, normalized deviance from proper practices, or management cultures that prioritize production over safety. The full investigation would take time, with OSHA inspectors, fire marshals, and potentially other agencies examining the wreckage, interviewing survivors, reviewing maintenance records, analyzing equipment remains, and piecing together the sequence of events that led from a normal Monday afternoon to catastrophic explosion. 2 days after the explosion, the disaster required an eerie additional chapter that would fuel conspiracy theories and raise troubling questions. 5 employees of the Center for Toxicology and Environmental Health, a consulting firm based in Arkansas, were traveling by private aircraft to Ohio to assist with the investigation and environmental assessment of the Schumann site. Their twin-engine plane crashed shortly after noon on Wednesday near Little Rock, Arkansas, killing all 5 people aboard. The Center for Toxicology and Environmental Health specializes in responding to industrial accidents, chemical spills, and environmental disasters, providing expertise in assessing health risks, environmental contamination, and remediation strategies. These 5 professionals were heading to Oakwood Village to help determine what hazards the explosion and fire had created, what environmental contamination might exist, what cleanup would be required, and what health risks might face workers and nearby residents. Instead, their plane went down, adding 5 more names to the death toll associated with the Schumann disaster. The Federal Aviation Administration launched an investigation into the crash, which appeared to be a separate accident unrelated to the industrial explosion, but the timing and connection were enough to spark speculation on social media about whether the crashes were somehow connected, whether someone might have wanted to prevent investigation of the foundry, whether there were corporate secrets worth killing for. The reality was almost certainly more mundane, that the plane crash was a tragic coincidence, that small aircraft accidents happen with unfortunate frequency, and that there was no sinister conspiracy. But for families grieving the loss of 5 more lives, the distinction between conspiracy and coincidence mattered little. 5 professionals who had been alive and heading to work were now dead, their expertise lost, their families shattered, their deaths adding another layer of tragedy to an already terrible disaster. The Schumann explosion occurred in a particularly fraught moment for Ohio industrial safety. Just 17 days earlier, on February 3, 2023, a train had derailed in East Palestine, Ohio, releasing hazardous chemicals including vinyl chloride that prompted evacuation of thousands of residents and raised serious questions about rail safety, chemical transport regulations, and emergency response capabilities. The East Palestine disaster had dominated headlines, with images of the controlled burn of toxic chemicals creating a massive mushroom cloud that looked apocalyptic, with residents expressing fear about long-term health effects from chemical exposure, with political finger-pointing over regulatory failures and corporate negligence. Then, before East Palestine had faded from the news cycle, before residents had returned home and resumed normal lives, before the full consequences of that disaster were even understood, the Schumann explosion erupted with its own massive smoke plume, its own injuries and death, its own questions about safety failures and regulatory oversight. Ohio residents, particularly in the Cleveland and Youngstown areas, began asking what was happening to their state, why industrial disasters seemed to be striking with alarming frequency, whether regulatory systems had broken down to the point where companies could operate dangerous facilities without adequate oversight. The proximity in time and space of East Palestine and Schumann, while likely coincidental rather than indicative of any systemic connection between the specific incidents, contributed to a growing sense that something fundamental was broken in how industrial safety was managed, monitored, and enforced. The economic impact extended beyond the immediate costs of emergency response, medical treatment, and property damage. Schumann employed dozens of workers who suddenly found themselves without jobs, without income, facing uncertain prospects for when or if the facility might reopen and resume production. In industrial communities, these jobs often provide middle-class incomes to workers without college degrees, supporting families and contributing to local tax bases and economic activity. The sudden loss of those jobs ripples through communities as workers reduce spending, struggle to pay mortgages and bills, and face potential foreclosure or bankruptcy if replacement employment isn't found quickly. The company's customers, manufacturers who relied on Schumann's copper and bronze alloys for their own production needs, had to scramble to find alternative suppliers, potentially facing production delays and increased costs. Insurance companies faced massive claims for property damage, business interruption, worker injuries, and potential liability lawsuits. OSHA would likely issue significant fines for the violations that contributed to the explosion, adding to the company's financial burden. Civil lawsuits from injured workers and Mullins' family were virtually certain, seeking compensation for medical costs, lost wages, pain and suffering, and potentially punitive damages if the evidence showed particularly egregious negligence. The total economic impact, when all costs were tallied, would likely reach millions of dollars, distributed across insurance companies, the company itself, workers and their families, and the broader community. The lessons from Schumann align depressingly well with lessons from countless previous industrial disasters. Worker safety cannot be treated as secondary to production goals. Safety violations are not isolated incidents, but symptoms of underlying cultural and systemic problems that require comprehensive responses rather than minimal compliance with citations. Previous accidents should trigger searching examinations of all related processes and procedures, not just fixes to the specific circumstance that caused that particular accident. Third-party oversight through agencies like OSHA serves a critical function but cannot substitute for internal safety culture that treats worker protection as a core operational requirement rather than a regulatory burden to be minimized. In the hierarchy of needs within industrial operations, worker safety must come first, not as a feel-good slogan, but as a practical operational priority reflected in budgets, staffing, training, equipment maintenance, and management decision-making. When companies treat safety violations as acceptable costs of doing business, paying fines when caught rather than preventing violations in the first place, they create conditions where catastrophic accidents become increasingly likely. The fact that Schumann had documented safety violations, had previous incidents involving molten metal burns, had paid OSHA penalties, and yet continued operating largely unchanged until explosion and death forced attention to systemic problems, represents a failure not just of one company, but of the broader regulatory and economic system that allows such patterns to persist. The facility at 22,500 Alexander Road sits idle now, a burned-out reminder of what happens when safety warnings are ignored, when previous accidents are treated as isolated incidents rather than symptoms of systemic failure, when production goals override worker protection, and when regulatory oversight proves insufficient to prevent companies from gambling with workers' lives. Steven Mullins cannot tell his story of what he saw or experienced in his final moments, but the facts speak clearly enough. A man who devoted 30 years of his working life to a company died because that company failed to maintain adequate safety standards, failed to respond appropriately to previous incidents, failed to create a culture where worker safety was truly paramount, and failed to recognize that foundry work being inherently dangerous is an explanation for needing exceptional safety measures, not an excuse for accepting preventable accidents. The 14 people injured, some critically, carry physical and psychological scars from an event that should never have happened. The 5 environmental consultants who died in a plane crash while traveling to investigate the disaster add their own tragic dimension to a story already filled with preventable loss. The broader community, which watched smoke rise into the sky and felt buildings shake from the force of the explosion, learned once again that industrial disasters are not abstract historical events, but immediate threats that can erupt without warning when safety is compromised. The investigation will eventually produce findings and recommendations. OSHA will issue citations and possibly significant penalties. Lawsuits will work through the courts. The company may or may not rebuild and reopen the facility, but nothing will bring back Steven Mullins, or restore the health of those injured or erase the trauma experienced by workers who barely escaped. The fundamental lesson, taught again at terrible cost, is that industrial safety is not negotiable, that cutting corners in pursuit of efficiency or profit creates ticking time bombs, and that the workers who show up day after day to perform dangerous jobs deserve far better than facilities that treat safety violations as acceptable risks and previous accidents as unfortunate but unavoidable costs of doing business.